Hi, I'm Richard Campbell. It's excited to be here. It's neat to be at an NDC London conference that's actually in London. So, because as near as I can tell, Docklands, not actually London. I wrote my first line of code in 1977. Of course, that's not the most important thing that happened in 1977. The most important thing that happened was Star Wars. Right? You gotta keep our priorities straight. And that line of code was written on a TRS-80 Model 1. 4K of RAM, cassette tape player for storage, 127 by 47 resolution graphics, and a version of BASIC not written by Microsoft. It was actually a tiny BASIC. And it only had 3 error messages. What? How? And sorry. Which I still think is the best error message ever. Now, granted, I am Canadian, so I have a special relationship with sorry. But it also is honest. I mean, what's object not found, but sorry. So divide 1 by 0, sorry. I've done a few things since then, and maybe some of you are .NET Rocks listeners. Anybody? Oh, wow, a few in the room. So my friend Carl Franklin started the show back in 2002. I came on board in 2005. As of today, there are 1,511 episodes. Please do not go through the entire catalog. It's not worth it. Yeah, a lot of shows. I have, since 2007, made a show called Run As Radio for IT pros once a week since April of 2007. So I'm persistent. And we also, for briefly, made the tablet show, which in the context of this story, talking about the history of .NET, it has a role to play. So we started it in 2011, and don't forget that, because there's a reason we started in 2011. And then we eventually rolled it into .NET Rocks, so only 130 episodes there. But we got to talk about Microsoft, and I'm going to use their logos to set the time scale. So when you see this logo, what do you think? Do you think disco? Because you'd be about right? That's 1975, right? Microsoft was formed because of this computer, the IMSA 8800. This is the device that convinced Bill Gates to drop out of Harvard and move to Albuquerque, New Mexico, with his friend Paul Allen to write a version of BASIC for this machine. And if you want to see a copy of it, that's in the Computer History Museum in outside of San Jose, California. It's an 8K BASIC, and this was one of their original products. And I think it's important to remember that Microsoft started as a programming languages company. And they had a mantra that was very much around how software unlocked the exponential experience of computers. See, up until this point, when you bought a computer, it came with software. The software was specific to the machine, which means each machine you bought had different software on it, and it wasn't all that good because it was free. It was included in the box. And Bill knew that he wanted to uncouple that he wanted common software to run across multiple machines. It takes time to build hardware, and the hardware is always falling behind. So making the software increment independently and research independently was going to make all the difference. And in that time frame is when he also wrote the open letter to hobbyists, because of course hobbyists were sharing software. The idea that software cost money was an anomaly. Bill also invented the end user license agreement. That thing you click OK to, that's Bill. Because it does 2 things. One is it talks about the fact that you have not actually bought this software, but you've bought the right to use it. And that the limit of the warranty of the software is how much you spent on it, not how much it ruined your life. Right? So I'm afraid 1,000 years from now, we may remember Bill only for his EULA, although I think curing malaria might beat that out. But let's fast forward up to the 1980s Microsoft. Again, you can tell by the logo. And that's when Microsoft completely changes because of DOS. Now they're writing an operating system, but the mantra is still true. They're writing software that runs across machines. One of the reasons they got involved with DOS is that the way that IBM was making that machine, there could be clones. There were multiple companies making these machines, and they could write an operating system that went across all of them. So the exponential effect of software continued to apply. But the operating system would start to consume them. It would change the way the company operated. They started selling it on the basis of, if you sell a computer, you pay us for a license of DOS. And that naturally morphs into Windows. And that takes us to the 1990s version of Microsoft. So the 1990 version of Microsoft, they have now made, Windows has become a thing. They've created the 32-bit jump with Windows 95 and bridged that gap. And they're continuing to build multiple development tools. And this is our setup to talk about .NET. The first version of Visual Studio in 97 had this array of products in it. So their core product really was C++. They've been making a version of C++ for a long time. Visual Basic was relatively newer, coming along in 91, though now it's 97, and this is the second to last version of VB. They had bought Visual Fox Pro and kept it in the box. Visual J++ is Microsoft's implementation of Java, written by Andrew Salzberg. That's what Bill had hired him away from Borland to do this. Now, it won't last very long for various reasons, but that's what was going on there, and it was a very well-received version of Java. Visual InterDev is one of Microsoft's first attempts to build tooling for the web. The Internet Tidal Wave letter that Bill put out in 95, roughly a year and a half on, when this actually is around, this is their attempt at tooling. Now, InterDev doesn't last very long, and nobody's unhappy about that. And we still have Visual Source Safe. Enough said. A year later, it's interesting to say that there was this idea with Visual Studio that it would be a consolidated development environment. They had all these different teams building products, and they all had to build their own IDEs, their own editing environments, their own debugging tools. It was expensive, so they had this idea that they wanted to consolidate. And so here was Visual Studio, which had a shared IDE. It was shared between J++ and InterDev, because VB, C++, and Fox Pro all had their own, but it was in the same box. And a year later, they renumbered everything to 6, because naming by years is too easy. Let's call everything 6, and in fact, we'll rename all the products 6 too. So it's VB6 and C++ 6, which were actually 6s. It's InterDev 6, which is actually the second version of InterDev and the last. And J++ 6, which is the third edition, although it was really numbered 2, and it's also the last. Because Microsoft's implementation of Java focuses on running Windows extremely well, and that upsets Sun Microsystems, and is it technically in violation of the agreement they had, and so a lawsuit ensues, and by the end of 98, Microsoft can have nothing to do with Java whatsoever. Now, that's June of 98. The core issues around .NET are already fomenting. Nobody set out to make .NET. .NET emerged from a set of problems. But another problem that's happening right then, and you need to talk about it to understand what was going on inside of Microsoft, involves these guys. Now, I love this picture. It's a Getty picture because they look so happy. Right? This is taken in July of 1998, shortly after Studio 6 had shipped, and right before the Department of Justice comes after Microsoft in a big way. And you got to understand how big a deal this was. It's 20 years ago now, but in June of 95, this is the cover of Time. Bill Gates is the master of the universe. This will change. 3 years later, he's being deposed by the US Senate, and you can watch this deposition on YouTube if you care to. It does not go well. Bill does not help his cause. He doesn't know why he's there. He doesn't understand why he's talking to these idiots. And he is, the polite term would be recalcitrant. And it kicks off a really fierce investigation and lawsuit that lands in November of 99. That's the Time cover. You've gone from master of the universe to 4 years later, busting Bill, where Microsoft in November of 1999 is declared a pernicious monopoly and ordered to break up into two companies, an operating system company and an everything else company. Now, this hits Bill pretty hard, and this is a photo from the press conference just a few years later. Like, again, compare that to that Getty picture. He's stepping down as CEO, and his friend Steve is taking over. It happened fast, and it was of huge impact. Now, he doesn't leave Microsoft. He focuses on being chief architect. So he's working mostly internally into the organization, where Steve is on the front lines. And there's lots of software people that think that this was a mistake. And I can understand why people feel that way, but as I've studied this in more detail, I feel like Steve Ballmer was the right guy at the right time because he fought back successfully against the government. By November 2001, he they sign a consent decree that stops the company from being broken up, keeps it in one place, in peace, but it has certain rules they have to abide by, making source code available to certain companies so they can see how Windows works and take advantage of it, because that was the argument in the DOJ all along, that it was an unfair advantage. But at that time, you're starting to see the first whisperings of what will ultimately become .NET. In February of 2000, a month after Steve takes over as CEO, he talks about NGWS, or Next Generation Windows Services, although within a few months it'll be Next Generation Web Services. But it wasn't even .NET then. It was other ideas about what happened next for development. And so if you want to put together .NET, you have to talk about a variety of people with a variety of missions. And these are only representatives. Behind these three individuals are literally thousands of folks. So first is Brian Harry. Brian Harry wrote Visual SourceSafe, and Microsoft bought him and his company and Visual SourceSafe. And he worked on it for a number of years. But as SourceSafe ran its limit, around version 6, part of Studio 98, he got moved to another project. And the project was about managing runtimes. So the issue was this: the C++ team has a runtime, right? It was MFC and ATL. The VB team has a runtime. The Fox team has a runtime. And every time Windows makes a change, all of these teams go into a tizzy to try and get those things implemented, or not, as the case may be. And then customers are frustrated because they've seen new features on Windows and they don't have them in their development environment of choice. Doesn't it make sense that we would make one runtime, a common runtime, that would allow all of these languages to take advantage of those new features on Windows as quickly as possible? That is the project that Brian Harry is leading. Now, this will eventually become the common language runtime, and Brian will be part of shipping 1.10 and 1.1, and then he will go to begin work on what will eventually become Team Foundation Server. So he's only in for the first couple of years. The next problem space, Mr. Heilsberg. Now, brought on board to do Java, can't do Java anymore. And one would argue, if Sun had not done this, would we all be programming in Java? Because ultimately what he did was go back to basics, having understood what Java did, and he made a C-like language that was object-oriented, as in C object-oriented language. Cool. And you'll see that code. If you go dig around in the old docs, you'll find that code name and that namespace referenced every so often. It was the precursor to what would become C#. Anders also firmly believed in the idea of a common set of base class libraries. Again, in that time of programming, the late 90s, part of your job as a developer was to pick the tool set. Not just your editor environment, but what libraries were you going to use? Well, what database are we going to communicate with? Which library makes the most sense for that? What networking stack are we going to work on? Because TCP/IP hasn't won yet at this time. You're arguing over each one of those pieces, and Anders firmly believed that it should be one set, a common set that everybody will run here. Now, besides working on C#, he also built a product called J#. And J# was a bridge for his J++ developers to be able to move to C#. Anders cares very deeply about developers. You talk about the heart and soul of Microsoft support for developers, a lot of that power comes from Anders Heilsberg to this day. Third, another fellow we're going to see on Friday, Mr. Guthrie. In 1997, fresh out of Duke University, joins Microsoft. It is his first and only job. He's never worked anywhere else. He joins the NT Option Pack team, part of Studio 6, working under a guy named David Treadwell, and his direct report is a guy named Mark Anders. And they implement the next version of Active Server Pages as part of IIS4 in the NT Option Pack. Ships in November of '98, that's Studio 6. Now, normally when a product ships, everybody takes a couple of weeks off. You've gone through a dev march, not easy to push a product out, so they take a break. But it's the end of November, and so those first 2 weeks are going to be December, and then it's Christmas time. So for the most part, the team takes off for all of December. But Mr. Guthrie, in 1997, is in his early 20s, and he has just gotten the job of his dreams, and he doesn't really feel like not working. And he doesn't really want to go back to North Carolina to go out for Christmas either. So he stays in an apartment and works through that entire month prototyping something better. ASP Plus was the code name that he was prototyping. And what he wanted was something that worked through IIS and worked in that namespace, but also was object-oriented to its roots. And that could be a better programming model than what ASP represented. And he got a prototype working in that month that was shown off in January. And the language that they were programming in was Java. That's what they had for object-oriented languages at the time. So in January of 98, when he shows it off, they go, that's really cool, keep going on this, you got to get rid of Java. And that becomes a scramble that's a whole bunch of other stories. So I bring this viewpoint out to recognize none of these folks were focused on something called .NET. They were focused on solving three distinctly different problems. A common runtime, a new language, a way to get to the web that was more sophisticated than what had been done so far. By 2000, they start to have prototypes together. They sort of bump into each other. Right? Originally, Anders wasn't building a language with a common runtime. He ran into the common runtime team, and that created a separate conversation. One of the huge debates around that was managed memory. Should we do garbage collection, or should we do reference counting? Huge debate internally that would then propagate out into the world as well. But all of those fights happened inside of Microsoft. Now, at the time, Microsoft has been iterating very quickly. When you get to 2000, you think about 97 with Studio 97, 98 with Studio 6. On the Windows side, 95, 98, 98 SE, Windows 2000. Right? There's everything on Microsoft is firing at rapid order, delivering new versions. But by July of 2000, it's been 2 years since there's been anything out of any of the dev teams. Studio 6 shipped in 98, now it's 2000. They have this PDC, and they kind of blindside everybody with an announcement of this thing they do call, at that time, .NET. But there's also some political playing going on here. Remember that Microsoft's been declared a monopoly in November of 99 and ordered to break up in January of 2000. And Steve is now negotiating the consent decree at that time. And so one of the things they say in these announcements is that this will be a new platform based on internet standards. And they publish C# as an ECMA specification and the CLR as an ECMA specification. So they're showing that Microsoft is open. Not necessarily open source, but open. It's positioning to negotiate with the government, which will succeed. But we didn't know this at the time. All we saw was a whole new environment. Nobody thought this was going to be a big show. We were all kind of surprised by it. And we're like, wow, why didn't you tell anybody? It's like, we wanted to surprise you. Windows 2000 ships this time. Now, this is a big deal version of Windows because this consolidates the NT line and the 9X line. It wasn't a great version of Windows. It was a good version of Windows, but it did a lot of important underpinning work. This is also when Microsoft goes TCP/IP first. The other networking stack still exists, but you default on TCP/IP. This is also where they abandoned Alpha, MIPS, and PowerPC. The earlier versions of NT actually ran on different platforms. This is the version where they go, it's Intel. So if you actually want to talk about the Wintel hegemon, it starts here with 2000. And it's also when we first started to get gigahertz processors in the form of the early Pentiums. By 2001, they shipped. Now, actually, before October of 2001, two things happened. In July of 2001, a very young Miguel Diaz-Casa, all of 29 years old, has run with the ECMA specifications that Microsoft has published, and at an O'Reilly conference says he's going to create Mono. That's the beginning of a Linux implementation of .NET based on the open standards. In August of 2001, IE6 ships, based on internet standards that are not ratified. And then at the same time, as .NET drops, the first version, XP comes out. Now, we called at the time XP, we have a fond memory of XP that is not from 2001. It's actually from about 2005. But in 2001, this thing didn't even support USB. It was almost not there yet. We called this Windows 2000 with the Fisher-Price interface because it had nice, curvy, colorful buttons and so forth. But it's also what our things are going to look like, right? That this was a new generation of software was going to look like moving forward. And this operating system utterly dominates the landscape. This is 96% of desktops within a few years are running XP. The whole world runs one operating system. Now, before this is released, earlier in 2001, we have this tremendous outbreak of malware. The anacornacarba virus, this is February of 2001. Code Red worm in July of 2001. Code Red 2 in August. The Nimda worm in September. It's just a debacle of constant hacking. Every month another announcement. And by January of 2002, Gates, these days a chief architect, not a CEO, puts out his internet security letter. He calls it trustworthy computing. And the main thing he says is to the entire organization, stop what you're doing, focus on security. Now for the XP team, what did this mean? XP is already well underway, and Service Pack 1 is already defined. It's all the stuff they're already cutting to get shipped, right? So XP Service Pack 2 is going to be the security fix. And one would argue that Microsoft made a mistake at this moment, because XP SP2 will be a breaking change to Windows. The enforcement of significant security rules is where UAC comes from, all of those sorts of things, will break software. They probably could have called it XP version 2, but they didn't. They called it a service pack because they wanted everybody to install it. That begins now, January of 2002. And by February of 2002, we get our first version of .NET. It ships. And this is the first version of C#, really the first time we've seen it. It's Microsoft's from-scratch written, object-oriented language all the way down. Of course, it runs against the CLR. FoxPro goes its own way. In the same time span, the Rotor project starts. This is a shared source implementation of .NET. You know, one of the jokes that was said back in 2014 when they open sourced .NET was, maybe the third time's a charm. So one of those early attempts was at this time frame with Rotor. I have some of the original marketing material that's been sent to me from 2002, and the pitch line for this version of .NET was 22 languages, one platform. Now, can you name 22 languages? Much less 22 languages that supposedly ran in .NET. Took me a while, I found the whole list. See if your language lists on this list, but yeah, there's some crazy, there was a version of Python that ran in .NET, okay. Some of these I'm not entirely sure are languages, and some of these are still supported to this day. They're third party and you have to pay for them, but IBM still ships a version of Fortran.NET, and Fujitsu still ships a version of COBOL.NET. And originally C# was called C#.NET until everybody figured out that's dumb. Now it's just called C#. The 1.1 edition comes out less than a year later, in April of 2003. And it is the bug fix edition. They fix a lot of things. But as people are now starting to exercise this development environment, they're finding non-trivial problems. And so the big push goes to 2.0. That's where they're really trying to do some fixes, and it'll take a couple of years to get there. So they put out one in 2002, they put out 1.1 in 2003, they won't ship the third version, called version 2, till 2005. And in the meantime, there's trouble brewing in the Windows world. So at PDC 2003 in Los Angeles was the first time we heard about Windows Longhorn. Now, the code name for XP was Whistler. And Whistler is a ski mountain not far from where I live. The next version of Windows, the code name, was actually Blackcomb. And Blackcomb never saw the light of day. It was a .NET version of Windows, top to bottom. They spent 2 years on it, and then they abandoned it in 2003. And if you ever go to the Whistler Village, where the Whistler Mountain and the Blackcomb Mountain are side by side. They've even got a gondola that goes between them. At the bottom between these two mountains is a very large bar called the Longhorn Bar. And so the backed off version of Blackcomb was called Longhorn. Now, one of the reasons that Microsoft even talked about this is that coming out of the consent decree was this understanding that people don't understand that Microsoft is a bunch of developers, a bunch of people, engineers, building things. And so this was the beginning of a more open Microsoft, where guys like Robert Scoble started running around with a camera and showing you the people that were building the products. And so the choice at PDC to announce we're building a new version of Windows, this is what it looked like, was all part of that response to the consent decree and this, Microsoft being the Borg mentality, try and make them appear more human. And again, one would argue this is a blunder because they were showing things that were far from ready. But they showed off, at this time, the three pillars of Avalon, Indigo, and WinFS. Right? Avalon was the new drawing system that was going to be amazing and beautiful and super fast. WinFS, Indigo was the communications library that was going to interoperate within the machine, across machines, across the internet, working exactly the same way. And WinFS was an object-oriented file system. In August of 2004, they finally shipped XP Service Pack 2. And you got to think about what was happening to the Windows team in this time frame. In order to do that set of security fixes, they had taken many of the most senior Microsoft people, guys who knew the deepest underpinning of Windows, and we were all pouring their energy into the Service Pack. While the new version of Windows, which started as Blackcomb and then became Longhorn, is being worked on by everyone else. So it is not until Service Pack 2 ships that the team kind of comes back together and focuses on what's the situation with Longhorn. And they know there's a deadline that most people have forgotten about. Because Microsoft had been in such this incredible cadence of shipping operating systems every year or every other year, and now it's 2004 and they have not shipped one, someone's reminded them of what the real deadline is. So most large organizations buy their software from Microsoft via a volume license agreement. And the volume license agreement doesn't really say it's this many copies of that and this many copies of this and so forth. What it really says is how many employees have you got? We'll give you a flat rate per employee and you get everything. And then they just try and encourage you to actually use it. But buried in those volume license agreements are guaranteed delivery dates for certain products. And one of those products is an operating system, which they guarantee a new version of every 5 years. And XP had shipped in November of 2001, and it is now August of 2004. And so they've got till November of 2006, and they're nowhere. If they had called SP2 version 2, they could have reset the counter, but they didn't for the reasons I previously stated. And so now the Windows team is under a serious time crunch trying to get a version of Windows out. Now over on the .NET side, life's pretty good because in 2005 they ship the third version of .NET, although the CLR is numbered version 2, because, version numbers are fun. One of the reasons the CLR2 arguably is the best version of the CLR they ever made is that they made a version for SQL Server. SQL Server 2005 had .NET running inside of it. I'm not saying it's a good idea, right? Now, the motivation is pretty straightforward. There were certain large customers of Microsoft's, financial services companies, typically out of the Northeast United States, that had a need for sophisticated languages working against data in near real time. And so querying against a database that was receiving all this data took too long. They wanted to do the analysis inside of the database. Now today we do that with reactive frameworks or streaming systems, but this is 2004. People don't know how to do that yet. They haven't thought that way. And typical of customers, like Ford supposedly said, I don't know if it's actually true, if I'd asked the customer what they wanted, they would have said faster horses. What the customer wanted was a database with a sophisticated language. And so there was a requirement to put C# inside of SQL Server. The side effect of that, by lifting the CLR out of Windows and running in the SQL context, they made it dramatically better. It was smaller, it was faster, it was far more reliable. It was the industrial strength version of .NET. And one would argue the original mission of .NET, of building a high-quality development environment that worked phenomenally well in Windows and let you work in the language of your choice, comes to fruition here. We've got, in 2.0, generics and partial classes. We have anonymous types. We're setting up for LINQ. We're not there yet, and nobody officially knows that. Internally, they're already debating it. We're headed in that particular direction. This is also the version that first supported 64-bit operating systems. So this is where we got compile any, which was great as long as you only compiled 32. As soon as you actually tried to compile 64, your software didn't work. It was pretty simple. So, and they also got rid of the .NET. It's Visual Studio, right? We're all together now. So the Windows team is in a terrible crisis. At the same time, the .NET team produces arguably the best version of .NET. So the CLR, the language, all of these things that come together very well. It's the web that's still struggling. Folks are not, they're productive with web forms, but they don't love them. And they're trying to find a better way to do things. And Microsoft puts together a new conference called Mix. And it was to focus on web development. And a few things came out of this very first Mix. One was Internet Explorer 7. It had been 6 years, or 5 years, right? This comes out in October of 2006. IE6 had come out in August of 2001. Where had they been all that time? The IE team was the team responsible for XAML. They were building Avalon. And that's where they went. And now they were done. And so they came back and made a new version of IE. And we heard the first rumblings of something called WPFE. But I'll talk about that in just a minute. So, November of 2006, Vista ships. Only the Enterprise Edition, the one required by the volume license agreement. Nobody installs it. Well, that's not true. None of us installed it because we don't have enterprise licenses, so we don't need to install it. No enterprise guys install it because enterprise guys know better. You wait for Service Pack 1. The only people that install it are the magazine review guys, right? The Daryl Tafts and the Paul Thurotts, and they find out it's not a good version of Windows. It shipped with some serious problems. Now, there's a whole bunch of reasons why this is true. One of them being that volume license agreement deadline. Hardware had changed. A bunch of the component models had changed, and so Vista struggled mightily. It will be fixed. By May of 2007, with Service Pack 1, which will also be the release of all of the other editions of Vista, it'll be fixed, and it'll be fine, and it'll be too late. My mother will tell me, I don't want that version of Windows. And I'm like, I don't think you're qualified for an opinion, but okay. And it's important to remember that in that same time frame, well, the other thing that happens as this happens is they put out an emergency version of .NET, .NET 3. And this is where Windows Presentation Foundation, Windows Communications Foundation, Workflow, and Card Space all come from. It basically, all the stuff they hauled out of Longhorn to get out the door with Vista lands in the .NET team's lap. And so they make a version of .NET 3.0, which is still CLR2 in 2006. In 2007, the first iPhone appears, June of 2007. Microsoft is busy. They're not paying a whole lot of mind, but it wasn't a great phone. This is the beginning. This was a 2G only phone. And Jobs told us if you wanted to program against it, you'll program in Safari. He was anticipating HTML5. He was ahead of his time. And I look at it as kind of the end of the phone, because before this phone, phones were kind of cool. Right? They had keyboards and antennas and GPS modules, and after the iPhone, every phone looks the same. So, you know, we've had 10 years of the same flipping phone. Now, it's just a slab of black glass. But that's fine, because we're getting new programming models. And one of them is WPFE. Now, that was its code name, was Windows Presentation Foundation Extensions. And our friend Brad Abrams told us if we give it a really bad code name, we get a really great product name. The product name was Silverlight. Give it a good code name like Avalon, you end up with a lousy product name like Windows Presentation Foundation. So, you know, get the order right. Of course, the early versions here, this is programmed in JavaScript. Right? It was really a media playback thing. It would take a few versions before they get all it in. But the big thing that happened with Silverlight is that Microsoft started, and when I say Microsoft, I mean Scott Guthrie, starts shipping out of band. He starts doing his own releases. He's not waiting for new versions of Studio. It gets confusing for us. It's hard to know what versions people have of things. It's too hard to install stuff. In October of 2007, well, August, September, October of 2007, Scott Guthrie goes on a bit of a hiring spree. He hires a bunch of folks that are here, actually. Guys like Rob Connery and Phil Hack, they're sitting in the back of the room, and Scott Hanselman. At the time, we called them Scott Guthrie's Ninja Army. But they were all pro open source. They were all big on building great software and shipping it when it was ready. And Scott had been working on some tooling for web development that was in ASP.NET Web Forms. And there's an apocryphal story about him going to a conference in Austin. It was the first alt.NET conference, which is a whole other conversation we probably shouldn't have right now. And he shows off for the first time MVC to the public. It had existed internally, and I'm pretty sure it recruited some of you guys, that it was a tool that he showed off to his Ninja Army folks to say, this is why you want to come on board. But it was a revelation, a testable, scalable approach to web development coming out of Microsoft. Because ASP.NET had always been, web forms had always been about easy to build, hard to scale. And here was an alternative, and it was a breakthrough. It was a real interesting push, and it sort of lit people up. By November of 2007, we have .NET 3.5. So this is the cleaned up version post-Vista. They start to build the designer tools, expression, and link first appears. So the beginning of that whole thing, and we get SQL, link to SQL, and a bunch of other link options in a otherwise pretty ordinary version of Studio. Brian Harry reappears at this point. Having worked on the CLR up to 1.1, he splits in 2003 to work on a secret project. 4 years later, they deliver that as Team Foundation Server and this team system. Silverlight's heyday really comes through, and actually web development as a whole. 2008, 2009, 2010, a lot happens. Things are moving really quickly. It's in 2008 the first version of Chrome appears. IE8 is out. The HTML5 specification finally hits public draft, so we're getting serious about what HTML5 is going to look like. Mono 2.0 comes out, all in the same time frame, keeping up with .NET to some degree, but a version is so behind. And even a version of Silverlight called Moonlight appears by the end of 2008, early 2009. And at the Microsoft PDC conference in 2008, where they announced Silverlight 2, we finally really see Ray Ozzie taking over for Bill as the chief architect. And his lead-off pitch is what would eventually be known as Azure, the beginning of this cloud concept. It doesn't resonate particularly well at this time, but he puts out a letter very much the same way that Bill always has, but about internet services and that whole model. By 2009, the Windows debacle has been cleaned up into a version of we call Windows 7, which for many people is still their favorite version of Windows. 9 years later, we still love Win 7. The guy leading that project, Steven Sinofsky, came from the Office team. He's contemporaries of Brian Valentine and Jim Alchin, both of whom dashed their careers on the rocks of delivering Vista. And by February of 2010, we have Windows Azure, the first sort of publicly facing version. It has a version of SQL Server called SQL Azure, and it has support for 3 development environments: .NET, Java, and PHP. The timing on this is stunning. So you kind of go, okay, we're good. Something's happening in the cloud. These were early versions. It was not that easy to work with, but we were getting there. In March of 2010, the iPad gets announced. The big iPhone is out. By April of 2010, Jobs puts out a letter called Thoughts on Flash. Now, what he knew was that Flash destroyed the battery of the iPad. And so his solution was to not allow Flash to run in Safari. And he did that by banning all add-ins. And there's a strong argument for that. By getting rid of add-ins, you get rid of a whole vector of malware, a bunch of problems that average people have. You could circumvent it. If you installed the Chrome version of iOS, you could still run Flash if you really wanted to. But he put the heat on Flash. They ultimately would stop making a mobile version of Flash because it kind of is an evil piece of software. But it impacts Silverlight. Silverlight's mantra had been that we were going to be able to run all these different places. They had a Mac version, they were looking at other platforms, but it required a runtime. And if you can't get the runtime deployed, well, you're going to have trouble. In April of 2010, they shipped Studio 2010. Now, Studio 2010 was a big version. It was the version where they started implementing WPF in a Microsoft product for the first time. WPF landed in 2006. It's been 4 years, but Studio actually implemented WPF and made it dramatically better. This is the first version with F#. This is also the version that shipped with jQuery. So Microsoft was starting to think differently about open source, that they would include an open source library inside of that. jQuery would end up needing legal protection that would create the jQuery Foundation, which today is now known as the JavaScript Foundation. So those are all part of these things that happened simultaneously with 2010. And at the same time, this is April of 2010, version 4 of Silverlight drops. It supports Chrome, it runs out of the browser, the tooling in Studio 2010 is pretty solid. And most of us, at this time in spring of 2010, are in a pretty happy place because we have this ability to program against these things. And we're open to the world is ours, C# XAML will do all the things. And then in the fall of 2010, PDC, the last PDC, done at the Microsoft campus in Redmond, only 1,000 people invited. The whole thing was streamed so you could see it. And virtually no mention at Microsoft's premier development conference about Silverlight. And so Mary Jo Foley, who's a well-known reporter in the Microsoft place, written a few books in the space, asks Bob Muglia, who was president of Server and Tools at the time, what's up with Silverlight? And Bob says, our strategy has shifted. But he realized this all happened back in the spring, in March, April timeframe, with Jobs' announcements. Microsoft had been dealing with this for a while. They just hadn't told anybody because they hadn't decided what they were going to do about it yet. And this is the moment that it gets outed in October of 2010. Now, a bunch of battles will happen over Muglia saying this, and he'll leave Microsoft by January of 2011. And the guy who'll take over his Server and Tools role is a young man by the name of Satya Nadella. This is also the time when Anders Hallsberg leaves the C# team. Mads Torgensen takes over for him, and Anders now starts working on a tool that will eventually be known as TypeScript. In 2011, we have the battle of the browsers. I think it was a really amazing time to be a web developer. As HTML5 is maturing and being agreed upon, the big browser houses, right? The IE team with the Chakra engine, the Google team, the Chrome team with the V8 engine, the Firefox guys, the Mozilla folks with JavaScript Core/Nitro, start going back and forth, iterating very rapidly, almost weekly releases. And if you were dumb enough to program against the new features, a week later you'd find out your app doesn't work anymore. But this is where we got GPUs incorporated into browsing and pre-compilation of JavaScript. Like the performance of JavaScript goes through the roof in a span of months, starting in early 2011. And that really leads to an explosion of a language called Node.js. Node had been around for a couple of years before this with this idea that JavaScript would live outside of the browser. But it's in 2011 that it becomes abundantly clear that JavaScript has ascended as its own language, that it's capable outside of that context, and there's many things we can do with it. And Node was one of the examples of that. And Microsoft puts on a new event called Build in September of 2011. Carl and I were there, and they were talking about the next version of Windows, Windows 8, and this focus on tablets. And they didn't talk much about .NET the whole time. Microsoft Premier event. We'd just gone through this the year before, where they'd done their Premier development event, not talked about Silverlight, and we saw what happened there. So here we were, not having conversations about .NET. In fact, they were talking about JavaScript. They were talking about Win.js, extensions for JavaScript to work with Windows directly. Carl and I walked out of Build at the end of it saying, wow, we make a podcast called .NET Rocks. What if .NET doesn't rock anymore? And so we started another show called The Tablet Show in 2011. You saw me pull up the slide on that. That's why. We were hedging our bets. We still made 2 .NET Rocks a week because there was lots to talk about, but we were making another show just in case. Okay? We know how this turns out, but at the time, we were all pretty freaked out. Now, there's a reason to think hard. At this particular time, Windows is declining in relevance. They've been losing market share steadily. iOS, Android, the programming language you're working at don't care about the platform anymore. And I went and pulled the annual report from Microsoft for 2011. They had a bunch of billion-dollar businesses. And with the exception of these three, Xbox, Bing, and Skype, all of them depend on Windows. Does it surprise you that they're pretty careful with taking care of their Windows business? It's the vast majority of their income in 2011. And we know that C# isn't going to run on all those other platforms, right? Microsoft told us so. But there was a dissenting voice, and he didn't work for Microsoft. It was this guy. At the same time that Microsoft seems to be moving towards JavaScript as the universal programming language across the platforms, Miguel de Icaza has implemented a thing called Monotouch, which is his own version of C#, and it compiles into iOS code and runs on the iPhone. And in 2011, he'll put out a version for Android as well. And then his company will be sold out from underneath him. Novell had been supporting Mono for many, many years, and Novell had now run out of money, and they sold the company to Attachmate. And Attachmate did not care about Mono, and basically told Miguel, lay everybody off, wind this thing down, forget about it. And Miguel chose not to. He called his friend Nat Friedman. They formed a new company called Xamarin. And they convinced Attachmate to sell them all the assets related to Mono, Monotouch, and Mono for Android. And that is the beginnings of Xamarin. And at the very moment that Microsoft is thinking about C# as not a way to work on these new environments, this little company is actually doing it. The same year. The timing's impeccable. And by 2012, we have a new version of Studio. Now, most people remember Studio 2012 as the all-caps version of Studio. But that's what we actually cared about, right? There were a few other things that happened in 2012. This is also when we get WinRT, and MVC4 is released. It's also when Microsoft sets up a group called Microsoft OpenTech as an independent organization that is specifically making sure that open source libraries work well with .NET tooling. Again, careful positioning of what's going on. And now comes the big shift. 2012 build, the second build. This is when they ship Windows 8, they ship WinJS 1.0, and they talk about the App Store that now has all these great Windows apps, Windows 8 apps. And 85% of them are built in C# and XAML. The rest are C++. There's virtually nothing built in WinJS. And Microsoft is really smart. They know how to lead a parade. They figure out which way the crowd is going, and they walk in front of them. And so the market shifts. We made our statement as developers. We continue to build the product. So shortly after that, by October 2013, they put out the next version of Studio. They fixed the all caps. That's the most important correction. MVC5 comes along, and we start seeing a rebirth of .NET as a whole. And there was a schism inside of Microsoft at this moment where they decided, which way are we going to go? And the way wasn't Windows first anymore. First clear evidence of that, they renamed Azure. Used to be Windows Azure. Now it was Microsoft Azure. And they finally got themselves a new CEO. In February of 2014, Satya Nadella stepped up. One of Satya's requirements for being CEO is that Bill would come back to Microsoft 1/3 time. And by all accounts, he's now half-time at Microsoft. He's not the face of Microsoft, but he's back to that chief architect role. He reviews all the products. And he's arguably in his best role for the company as a whole. And you saw this tone shift in 2014. By build in 2014, they produced the .NET Foundation. Xamarin is in that. They start creating an environment safe for open source products to live in the .NET space. Roslyn, the compiler as a service version of C#, the rewrite of C# in C#, which had been taking years, finishes, and not only is released, it is released open source, and cross-platform. You want to run in Linux? Knock yourself out. Want to run in the Mac? Knock yourself out. They rewrote it. TypeScript is out, and they make Windows free. That's where they announced this, is at Build 2014, for any device with a screen smaller than 9 inches. Which is an extraordinary shift if you think about from 2002, when it was 22 languages, one platform, that it was all about selling Windows. Now they're acknowledging that in some cases it makes sense for Windows to be free. And by the way, in this same time frame, in 2014, this is when the HTML5 specification finally gets ratified. So all these things have been moving at the same time. We're finally getting to standards. And by 2015, we get arguably the good new version of Studio, the one that I still like the best, the 2015 edition. This is also when we get Win 10 and the battles that Win 10 still represents, because it's still going on as to what Windows is going to look like going forward. They're changing the model of how they deliver Windows because they're no longer looking at it as their principal cash cow. The principal cash cow is going to be Azure. The MS OpenTech group that they created only a couple years before now just rolls into Microsoft. Right? It's just an acknowledgement now that this is an open source company, we build open source tools, and that's part of our whole job. So those pieces all come together. This is also when Visual Studio Code gets released. Certainly not going to make any money for Microsoft since it's free, but it's also a statement about Microsoft building really great products for folks that may never otherwise live in the Microsoft ecosystem in any way. And the rewrite of .NET now goes into play. So by June of 2016, we get 1.0, which is pretty rough. 1.1 in March of 2017 alongside of Studio 2017, and just this last fall in August of 2017 with .NET Core 2. And this is where they've been developing the .NET Standard, and they sort of hit their mark on version 2. I'm not saying it's perfect by any stretch of the imagination, but a strong version that shows they never tried to migrate the existing code base into open source. The licensing was too complicated, the rules were too complicated, it was easier to rewrite it. And so as all of these things become open source, you saw things like Xamarin abandon their version of C#, they use Roslyn. Abandon their version of the garbage collector, they use the Microsoft open source version because it's better. It turns out when you actually look at this code under the hood, it's better than you think. It's faster than you think. It's more sophisticated than you think. These were really extraordinary developers. We just never saw it before. We just can see it now. And so we are here now at the beginning of 2018. I know as a guy who talks to developers several times a week and receives feedback steadily that the customer base itself is remarkably split. That there's lots of folks that are excited about this open source world, that core is very interesting to them, that their ability to run across platforms is huge, and there's also a substantial chunk of the market that says, I don't know why they built those things. That I was happy in my Windows and framework world, and I'm worried they're not working on that anymore. Now, you know, for me as a storyteller, I'm going on collecting the story. I'm going to the guys, I'm going to the Jeff Fritzes, and they can actually tell us what they're working on, because they're allowed to talk about that. And so the team these things are all working in parallel. The resolution of this is not obvious. There's not one simple outcome to all those pieces. They're just moving. So the history is still being written. And we've come through some really big shifts in our mindset. And I don't know that all of us have gone on that ride. Right? It's fun for me to be able to go back and look back and to talk to the folks that built it and sort of assemble the story and realize how fast it actually happened. I hope you felt a little breathless there. So it changed. But we're not done yet. More is going to come. And I'll keep writing it down. Thanks for your time. So if I make it a book, would you buy it? Yeah, I just don't think I can get those guys on camera. I wouldn't mind making it a movie, but I don't know that they'd go for it. But my current best idea in terms of, and I'll happily take questions. We have a few minutes. Just put up your hand and we'll run the microphone over to you. I think the way I want to write the book is I want to tell a story of people, so that the book will be chronological, but each chapter will be about a person, and you'll learn about that person and what they do to .NET at that time, what's important. And so my goal would be for you to understand that person well enough to know why they make the decision they make. That's the best idea I have right now. But, it's a lot of writing ahead for me. It's trying to get this down to an hour there's a lot. I didn't talk about phone. I could, but I didn't. And I didn't talk about bears. Any other questions? No, sir? Run.
Do you think that Microsoft would have gone down the open source route had Azure not been such a success?
Well, and one would argue that Azure has not been that successful. I think they went down. What's interesting to me as I've assembled that narrative is recognizing that clearly Mr. Guthrie had decided on open source somewhere in the early 2007 timeframe, but he wasn't going to lead that fight. He put these guys in front. Like, he started hiring up a team and organizing things and pressing on licenses that began in 2007. And this is a big ship that they were trying to turn. So I think the acknowledgement that this stuff needed to head that way was aware early on. But there were plenty of forces that were adamantly against that. A story that I didn't tell, but I was there for, was when they went to Dev Intersection to do the announcement that they were going to open source .NET, Scott Hunter and Scott Hanselman were afraid that they were going to get called by Redmond saying, stop it, don't announce it, we're still making decisions. So they turned off their phones so that nobody could call them to stop them until after the announcements were made. And the silly part is that Guthrie, who didn't think he was going to be there for it, managed to get there and then was trying to reach them to tell them, hey, I can be a part of it, and he couldn't reach them because they turned off their phones. But yeah, there were strong forces that were pressing against that. If we go back to those billion-dollar businesses, Azure isn't even close to replacing it yet. They are absolutely betting the company on this. But what's the alternative? What if Build 2012 had been a huge success, Win.js had taken off, and they simply continued on that path and never gone the direction we are? Like, where would we be right now? It's a very interesting mental exercise, because I think we're still struggling with where they've gone. That there's plenty of folks that aren't real excited about the whole open source movement. They don't care about the cross-platform piece. Like, that's not important to them. So, and without a doubt, they're splitting their energy. You've got the core team, you've got the framework team. Like, there's only so many bodies that can work so fast, right? If they were doing more of those people doing fewer things, they would go faster. So there's a price they're paying. Maybe they would be in a very different spot than they are right now. But yeah, they're not doing any sure bets. We can't argue with the direction. It makes a lot of sense what they're doing. And what I appreciate about Microsoft's approach to this particular problem, this public computing problem, is they're allowing us to still do it private with the Azure Stack. More and more you're seeing the tooling will run on, the upside to the Docker Kubernetes approach, run on what you want. You're not bound to Azure. You can run on-prem, you can run on Google Cloud Platform, you can run on Amazon. So you can choose a stack that's agnostic to them if you want to, and they're supporting it. So yeah, the bet's not done, but all we know for sure is they're telegraphing what their bet is. I do think what they do better than just about anybody else is the platform play, right? Amazon, deep down, is a warehouser, right? They are about lowest price. They're going to be IaaS play all day long. The cheapest VMs in town. That's what they sell. That's what they know how to sell. That's what they do. Google is a very hip programming space. So hip languages, hip approaches, they certainly drove the Kubernetes thing forward in the first place. But Microsoft seems to be hitting a niche where that value add of, oh, so you want to do vision resolution? Here's a JSON call for you, and you can do it. That I don't know that anybody else could do as well as they're doing. So I think they found a part of how well they execute and how coherent it is. Because there's a part of Microsoft to me that feels like they're very nervous, they're very anxious, and everybody thinks they're doing the right thing at the same time, and there's only so much coordination between those groups. I mean, I think it's Hanselman that had that line, we are not as organized as we would need to be as evil as you think we are, right? They're a very large organization of people all thinking they're doing the right thing, but it's not the same thing, and they're not necessarily going the same reaction. And so part of the challenge for us on the outside is like, so which one of these should I use? We're happily doing shows on Kubernetes Docker. Boy, it makes the service fabric people unhappy, right? Different forces inside of Microsoft. They're all trying to solve a problem. So they're still feeling around for it too. I'm optimistic. Sir.
So I'm old enough to remember some of the things.
So you went with this ride with me? I'm glad.
So yeah, it reminds me when we fall out from our chairs in 2000 in the PDC.
Mm-hmm.
We went for something and we got NGWS, and it was a real surprise.
Yep.
But I'm also old enough to start to see things coming back at the same stuff. So we used to be C++, MFC,
Yep.
or maybe Borland and all that stuff when .NET came. And at that time, I remember going on with the mic and asking the PMs, saying, but .NET is nice, but there is no tooling, there is no libraries.
Yep.
It's very, very tiny. And we get what we ask in .NET. With .NET Core, it's the next generation, okay? And from people who are doing .NET, period, they don't really care. But for people like us, we are going to Linux and something like this,
Yep.
it means a lot.
Sure.
And we get to the same path, no tooling, no ecosystem. We are losing Windows, where
Yep.
we were used to have like performance counters, and now we are blind. We need to do some performance stuff, and we are using third parties. Friends are
Yep.
on the booth over there, okay? And now my fear is that Microsoft is focusing on Azure. I used to work for Microsoft for 6 years, okay? And we've seen the shift to Azure.
Yep.
And as developers, I think most of us are developers here, do you have any hint if Microsoft is pushing some resources for the developers and for .NET with the .NET Core?
Well, and I think you answered the question yourself. The history shows they lay the foundation and they build the walls and the roof. So they've laid the foundation with .NET Core. I would argue it wasn't until 2 that it was feature complete enough that you can even really say this is a foundation we can build on. So it's only been since August. I do expect them to build more. As for the shift to Azure, without a doubt they're shifting to Azure. But consistently, when they get pressure from their customers to say, I love that feature, can I have it on-prem too? We get it. They're not going to build it on a whim, but .NET messaging, the whole message framework that Clemens Vasters drove, started out as a .NET product, got yanked into Azure only, and then when we screamed loud enough, an independent version came back out again. So I think you're going to continue to see that oscillation. Right? That, yeah, Azure's always going to come first, but it doesn't preclude there'll be non-Azure versions of anything we demand. They are listening, and you can participate in their conversations now, right? The funny thing is they still appear secretive, even though they're doing everything in the open, because we can't keep up with how fast they put stuff out. Like everybody's wondering what's going to happen with XAML standard. If you want to know, go read the GitHub repository. The fights are going on in public. You just can't read them because they're long, and there's lots of them. So you go in and look at a bunch of the Azure tooling stuff that's in GitHub, you'll see that there's plans for off Azure versions of them.
Yeah, but it's Azure, and you skip all the phone and WinRT and UWP stuff that us as developer, they just remove all that stuff.
Now that's an interesting, I think it's a separate conversation necessarily what you were saying there about what about on-premise client-side development, the UWP stuff?
My point is the amount of resources that Microsoft is pushing. If you take a look at the GitHub stuff,
Yep.
look at the .NET Core and the number of people working on them, and look at the same for Azure, it's like 100 more on Azure than on
Yeah, I wouldn't disagree,
.NET.
because Azure has to come first. But eventually, what they're building in Azure winds down, and those guys still need jobs.
If they lose their developers.
Yeah, that's a good question. And I think it's always a race. But you've described the race they've played many times, right? We were happy VB, C++, MSC devs when they brought out this new platform and said, this is the way. And we're like, except for the part where it's really crappy, right? And then it got better. And they did pull people off the MSC libraries and off the VB libraries. So those guys didn't lose their jobs. They moved over and worked on the new stuff, and gradually the tooling got better. Is it a race? Absolutely it's a race. But they've won it before. Maybe we'll go away and come back. Like, there's lots of folks doing that now. Folks that got really frustrated with where Microsoft was at in 2011, 2012, that went off into other development environments and now find themselves wandering back because they're kind of interested in where we are right now. So it isn't going to be a painless path. That much I'm sure. And I have no insider knowledge than that. All I have is the historical reference. So I think they'll get there, not this week.
Thanks.
Sir.
Going open source for Microsoft was a quite big thing.
Yes.
If you can say, like, what are the thoughts inside Microsoft right now? Like, are you thinking that maybe there are some people there who are thinking of, again, closing the source, or this is the way forward?
The biggest thing that's happened to Microsoft now is that the legal department understands open source. So there are relatively few things that senior people in Microsoft fear, but Microsoft legal they fear. So, and when, I can't remember his name, they hired the chief counsel from Sun that wrote the original open source licenses. And that's what got them across. I remember interviewing him like 6 or 7 years ago. So deep down, Microsoft now understands from a legal corporate perspective how to open source things and why you keep them open source. So there's no way for them to go backwards that is not more damaging to the company than going forward. So I wouldn't worry about that aspect. Now, are there anti-open source contingents inside of Microsoft? Yes, there are. But they're losing, and they're getting old and dying, right? Like this is an old, Einstein writes general relativity in the 20s, and all the old physicists hate it, criticize it, and so forth. And the new physicists embrace it. And when Einstein gets interviewed on the radio and says, when do you see a universal adoption of general relativity as a model for the universe? He says, well, first the old physicists have to die. Right? So we have had a radical shift, and a contingent of Microsoft is all on board. It's the only way they think, and there's a bunch that don't. And so we're going to feel that pressure for quite some time until they move on. I don't want them to die, but retirement's not out of the question. They have a lot of money. If they've been with Microsoft for 20 years, where the stock price has gone in the past 5, go home. You're okay. But the interviews we've been doing, the conversation we've been having, the Windows code base is in Git now. Think about that. So DevOps practices and common source code repository practices, like modernization of the way that Microsoft builds software has now penetrated the most recalcitrant portions of Microsoft. With Office and SQL Server and Windows, those original bastion organizations that could resist everything new, even they are being moved. And that says to me, they're on a one-way path. Nobody moves source code because it's fun. It's not. The largest source code library in the world, Windows, now lives in Git. That's a one-way trip. So I'm pretty confident that those moves are permanent, that this is now the path. Is everything Microsoft going to be open source? Probably not. And not everything should be, right? But this new philosophy is not a temporary part of Microsoft. It is a permanent part of Microsoft. You bet. Folks, have a great show. We got 2 more days to go. Pace yourself. It's a marathon. There's lots to do. Carl and I will be recording shows every day in the afternoons. We've got a little booth in the back corner there. By all means, peek in. If the door's closed, we're recording, but in between, love to say hi and shake your hand. Thanks so much for coming out.